She was the woman nobody wanted. He was the man nobody understood. And when the most feared mountain man on Blackstone Ridge passed over a line of beautiful brides to point at her, the fat girl standing in the back staring at her boots, the entire frontier town went silent. Then the laughter started. But Silas Vane wasn't laughing. He never laughed. And that silence behind his cold grey eyes, that was the most terrifying thing anyone in that crowd had ever seen. This is their story. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments below. I want to see how far the story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. Chapter 1. The mule died on a Tuesday. That was how Silas Vane measured bad luck, not in weeks or seasons, but in the animals he lost. The horse 3 winters ago, 2 of his best hounds the winter after that, and now Luther, his grey-eared mule, who had hauled timber, dragged elk carcasses, and walked these mountain paths without complaint for 11 years. Luther went down in the snow at the base of Blackstone Ridge with a broken foreleg and didn't get back up. Silas stood over him for a long moment. The wind cut across the ridge and threw ice crystals into his face. He didn't blink. He pulled the rifle from his back, worked the bolt, and did what needed doing. The shot echoed off the frozen cliffs and scattered a pair of ravens from a dead pine 30 yards away. Silas watched them go. Then he shouldered Luther's load himself, 200 pounds of salted meat, rope, and winter traps, and started the 2-mile climb back to his cabin in the dark. Han didn't complain. There was no one up here to complain to. Silas Vane was 34 years old and looked 45. Not because he was frail, the opposite. He was the kind of man whose face had been remade by weather and labor until it no longer resembled anything soft. A jaw like a stone ledge, a nose broken twice and never set properly, a scar along his left cheekbone from a trapper's knife, pale and slightly raised, like a seam in old leather. I was big. Not tall in a way that seemed accidental, but big in a way that suggested the mountain had made him. Shoulders that filled a doorframe, hands that could haul a 100-pound iron trap as casually as another man might carry a satchel. In summer, when the traders came up the eastern pass, they gave him extra room on the trail without thinking about why. In winter, when the mountain closed off and the snow came down like a punishment, Silas was the only living thing on Blackstone Ridge that didn't seem afraid. His cabin sat at 4,000 feet, tucked against a granite outcrop, like it had grown there. 2 rooms, a stone hearth big enough to burn whole logs, a workbench along the south wall, where he sharpened tools and repaired traps by lamplight, a rope bed with a mattress of pine boughs and bear hide. The walls were hung with pelts and dried herbs and a single shelf of books, real books, not almanacs or pamphlets, that he'd carried up from the valley one summer years ago and read so many times. The spines had cracked and been repaired with strips of leather. He lived alone. He preferred it. This is what the traders said about him in the valley. Silas Vane's a hard man. Fair but hard. Don't owe him anything. Don't cross him either. What the traders didn't say, what they couldn't quite articulate over their whiskey and their card games, was that they were also a little afraid of him. Not afraid of violence exactly. Afraid of something quieter and harder to name. The way he looked at you like he was calculating the weight of your character and finding it insufficient. The way he never smiled at jokes that were meant to be funny. The way he seemed to need nothing from anyone, which made other men feel vaguely useless in his presence. He had come to the ridge 12 years ago, fresh off a bad stretch in the lowlands that he'd never explained to anyone and that no one had been bold enough to ask about. He'd built his cabin with timber he cut himself, cleared his own trapping lines, and over the course of several brutal winters established himself as the most productive fur trapper in the upper Blackstone territory. I was not sociable, he was not warm. He was, in the estimation of most people who encountered him, deeply and irreparably alone, by choice, by nature, or by some wound the mountain kept him from having to explain. Every spring, traders came up the pass to buy furs. Every spring they brought supplies, news from the valley, and increasingly in recent years, unsolicited opinions about Silas Vane's domestic situation. Chapter 2. The trading post at Cutter's Ford was a 2-day ride from the base of Blackstone Ridge, and Silas made the trip twice a year, spring and late autumn, to sell pelts and resupply. He did not enjoy the trip. He found the noise of the settlement grating, the conversations pointless, and the smell of too many unwashed humans in an enclosed space deeply unpleasant. But this spring he had furs to sell, and furs wouldn't sell themselves. He arrived on a grey Wednesday morning with 2 mule loads of pelts. He'd borrowed a mule from the Harwick homestead 3 miles down the eastern slope, an old brown thing that walked with a limp but didn't complain, and tied up outside Gideon Marsh's trading post before the place had properly opened. Marsh himself came out to meet him, wiping his hands on a stained apron, his small eyes already doing the arithmetic on the furs before Silas had dismounted. Vane. He nodded. Good haul this season. Decent, Silas said. That was roughly the extent of their pleasantries. They haggled for 20 minutes in the cold, which was less haggling and more Silas stating a number, Marsh countering, Silas not moving, and Marsh eventually accepting. Silas had the patience of geology. It was one of his few conversational advantages. By the time they'd finished and Silas had his payment, coin plus credit for supplies, a small crowd had gathered outside the trading post, in the way that small crowds gather around anything moderately interesting in a settlement with not enough to do. 4 men. Silas knew 2 of them. Dalton Webb, a middling trapper from down the valley who owed Silas a favor he'd never repaid, and the older Hennessy brother whose name he could never remember. The other 2 were strangers, traders by the look of their gear, come up from somewhere south. Vane, said Webb, with that particular tone men use when they're about to say something they think is entertaining, and that Silas was already exhausted by. You hear they're bringing brides up from Millhaven. Silas was loading his supplies onto the limping mule. He didn't look up. No, he said. Whole group of them, Webb continued, undeterred. Young women looking to marry into frontier life. Reverend Aldous organized it. Families are sending daughters who haven't found matches down south, he grinned. Figured you might be interested. Man living alone up on that ridge. I'm not interested. Now I know you've said that before, then you know my position. Webb wasn't deterred by much. It was one of his least appealing qualities. Thing is, he pressed, leaning against the post railing, with the energy of a man who had nowhere to be and no sense that his audience might prefer his absence. Marsh is putting on a proper showing this afternoon. All the women in the square, families and bachelors to meet them, very organized. Aldous has papers and everything. Silas finished tying the last pack. He looked at Webb for the first time, and Webb, to his credit or his survival instinct, straightened up slightly. I've got a 2-day ride home, Silas said. I don't need a wife. Every man needs... Goodbye, Webb. He would have left. He had intended to leave. The mule was loaded, the sun was climbing, and he had 2 days of trail ahead of him before he'd be back on his own land. But the mule had gone lame in the night. The leg Silas had known was trouble from the start, and the farrier in Cutter's Ford said it would be 3 days before the animal could travel. Silas didn't argue. He unloaded his packs into the storage room Marsh rented by the day, paid for a stall at the livery, and resigned himself to 3 days in a settlement he disliked, with nothing to do and everywhere to be annoyed. The showing was that afternoon. I didn't go to watch it. He sat in the trading post drinking coffee that was mostly grounds and reading through a water-stained almanac he'd already read twice, trying to look like a man who existed entirely outside the social event, occurring 50 yards away in the settlement square. He lasted approximately an hour and a half. It wasn't curiosity that finally moved him from his chair. It was the noise, specifically the laughter. A particular kind of laughter he recognized, the kind that had a target, rising and falling with the specific rhythm of a crowd enjoying someone else's discomfort. He'd heard that sound before. He didn't like it. He set down the almanac and walked outside. Chapter 3. The square at Cutter's Ford was a loose rectangle of packed earth, surrounded by the trading post, a tavern, a smithy, and several storage buildings. In the warmer months there was sometimes a market here. Today, in the weak spring sunlight, Reverend Aldous had arranged a kind of informal presentation. 8 or 10 young women standing in a loose line while the men of the settlement circulated and introduced themselves, as though this was something other than what it was. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd with his arms crossed and watched. The women were varying degrees of uncomfortable. Some of them had fixed their faces into careful, pleasant expressions that clearly cost them something. 2 were talking to each other in low voices, managing to look like they were making the best of it. 1 was crying very quietly in a way she probably thought no one could see. The men of Cutter's Ford were, by and large, doing what Silas expected them to do, evaluating, walking the line, making comments to each other that they thought were quiet and weren't. One of the traders from the south kept addressing individual women in a loud performative voice as though he were announcing livestock at auction. Silas watched all of this with an expression that several people who glanced at him later described as somewhere between disapproval and contempt. Then he saw what had caused the laughter. At the far end of the line, separated slightly from the other women, whether by design or by the subtle social architecture of cruelty, stood a young woman who was not, by the aesthetic standards of Cutter's Ford or anywhere else in the frontier territory, what the assembled men had come here hoping to find. She was heavy, not simply rounded, but genuinely large in a way that made her ill-suited to the frontier ideal of femininity that these things always seem to presuppose. Her dress, brown wool, practical, not pretty, fit her poorly, straining at the shoulders and pulling at the waist. Her hair was dark and had been arranged with some effort that the wind had since partly undone. She had a wide face, a strong jaw, and dark eyes that were, at this precise moment, fixed on a point on the ground, approximately 2 feet in front of her boots. 3 men near her were laughing, not attempting to conceal it. One of them made a remark to his companion that Silas couldn't hear from where he stood, but he could see the woman's jaw tighten, and he understood the shape of what had been said. She didn't look up, she didn't respond. She just stood there, absorbing it, her hands folded in front of her, her face carefully blank in the practiced way of someone who had decided a long time ago that reaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. Silas felt something shift in his chest, not pity. He'd spent enough time in uncomfortable situations to know what pity felt like, and this was different. It was closer to recognition. He uncrossed his arms and walked forward. Reverend Aldous was a small, precise man with the energy of someone who believed very strongly in the righteousness of whatever he was currently organizing. He intercepted Silas at the edge of the line with an expression of surprised delight, the way a man looks when he's been hoping for something and suddenly sees it approaching. "Mr. Vane," he said warmly, "I'm so glad I'm looking," Silas said, not necessarily participating. Of course, of course." Aldous fell into step beside him with the practiced persistence of a man who had long ago mastered the art of accompanying people who hadn't invited him. "Wonderful group of women, fine families, all of them. We've had 3 matches just this morning." Silas had stopped walking. He was looking at the woman at the end of the line. Aldous followed his gaze and cleared his throat. "Ah, that's Miss Holloway, Mara Holloway, from down in Greer County. Her family is, well, they're decent folk. She has a strong constitution, works hard. What's her name?" "Mara." Silas was quiet for a moment. "She's been standing there the whole time. She arrived with the others this morning. I'll confess she hasn't had a great deal of—" "Introduce me." Aldous blinked. Pardon." "Introduce me to her." Silas looked at Aldous, and something in that look removed the Reverend's instinct to ask follow-up questions. "Please," Silas added, a word he used infrequently enough that it came out slightly awkward. Mara Holloway knew he was coming before he arrived, because the laughter nearby stopped, which meant something unusual was happening. She kept her eyes on the ground for another few seconds, a habit buying herself time, and then she looked up. The man walking toward her with the Reverend was the largest human being she had seen outside of a county fair strongman contest. He moved carefully, the way very large things often move, with a precision that suggested he'd spent a long time in spaces that weren't designed for someone his size. His face was weathered to the point of severity, scarred, expressionless in a way that might have been frightening if he'd been moving fast. He wasn't moving fast. He stopped at a respectful distance, which wasn't something the other men had done. She waited. "Miss Holloway," Aldous said, with the slightly too bright energy of a man hoping he'd done something clever. "This is Mr. Silas Vane. He's a fur trapper, operates up on Blackstone Ridge." "I know who he is," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. She'd heard of Silas Vane. Everyone in this part of the territory had. "Mr. Vane, Miss Holloway." He had a low voice, quiet in a way that made you pay attention. I didn't say anything else immediately, which was uncomfortable, but Mara had learned that sitting with discomfort was better than filling the silence with something stupid, so she waited him out. "You've been standing here a while," he said. "I have." "The Reverend tells me you're from Greer County." "Yes." "Long way to come." "It is." She watched him, trying to read something in his face and finding very little. He wasn't looking at her the way the others had, not with amusement or assessment or the particular brand of dismissive pity she'd already grown familiar with today. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you're trying to figure out what it actually is, which was disconcerting in a different way. "What do you want?" he asked. The directness of it knocked the script out of her head. She'd had answers prepared, something about frontier life, about building something worthwhile, the thing she imagined a man like this would want to hear. Instead, what came out was the truth. "To not be here," she said. "In Greer County, I mean. I want to be somewhere else." Something moved across his face, not a smile, something quieter. "I've got a cabin on Blackstone Ridge," he said. 2 days' ride north. No neighbors for 4 miles. In winter the snow comes up past the windows and the wind sounds like something alive." He paused. "It's not an easy life." "I know." "Do you?" "No," she admitted. "Probably not, but I know what I'm leaving, and this seems better." He looked at her for another long moment. The Reverend beside him was barely breathing. "All right," Silas said. Chapter 4. The crowd noticed. Of course it did. The crowd at something like this always noticed everything and forgot the parts that complicated the story it wanted to tell. What the crowd saw: Silas Vane, the most feared and respected mountain man in the upper territory, passing over a line of 7 presentable young women, including 2 that several local men had already been circling hopefully, to introduce himself to the fat girl at the end of the line, who'd been standing there all morning with nobody talking to her. What the crowd heard next, passing from person to person in the particular telephone game distortion of settlement gossip, was a version of events that ranged from Vane's lost his mind, to he did it to insult the Reverend, to he probably just wants someone to haul wood, what they said to his face, or more accurately, what Dalton Webb said to his face, because Webb had the distinction of being simultaneously the most socially aggressive and the least self-aware man in Cutter's Ford, was this: Silas. Webb caught up with him outside the trading post an hour later, where Silas was making arrangements with Marsh for his gear. What are you doing?" "Getting my affairs in order," Silas said, "so I can leave." "I mean with the Holloway woman." Webb glanced around to see who was listening, which was almost everyone within earshot. "Silas, there were 7 others. Young women, healthy. You could have had your pick of—" "I did have my pick," Silas said. Come on, look at her." Silas turned from the counter and looked at Webb with an expression that Webb later told people made him feel like he'd said something that revealed a fundamental character flaw he hadn't previously been aware of. "I looked," Silas said quietly. "Did you?" Webb opened his mouth, closed it. "She's been standing in that square since this morning," Silas continued, his voice low and even, not angry exactly, but carrying the weight of something that wasn't quite patience anymore. 7 hours. Every man who walked past her either said nothing or said something he thought was funny. She didn't flinch once, didn't argue, didn't beg anyone to reconsider. He picked up his supply list and turned back to the counter. "That's not nothing, Webb, but we're done talking about this." They were. Mara, for her part, found out about the arrangement second-hand, from Reverend Aldous, who delivered the news with the cautious enthusiasm of a man uncertain whether he was delivering good news or terrible news, and covering his bases by presenting it as neither. "Mr. Vane has expressed interest," Aldous said carefully, in the small room the Reverend's wife had set aside for the woman to wait in. "He'd like to. That is, he's proposed that you travel with him to his homestead, with the understanding that—" "What does he actually want?" Mara asked. Aldous blinked. "Well, a partner for his—" "Did he say why he chose me?" A pause. Not in explicit terms, no." Mara looked at her hands. They were calloused from years of work, her father's farm, her uncle's shop, whoever needed something hauled or cleaned or fixed in Greer County, because Mara was capable and didn't complain, and was therefore available in ways that people found it easy to take for granted. She was 22 years old. She had spent 22 years being overlooked, underestimated, and treated with the particular brand of casual cruelty that tends to attach itself to anyone who doesn't conform to the shape that society decided was acceptable. She had not come to Cutter's Ford expecting this. She'd come because the alternative, staying in Greer County, becoming permanent furniture in her brother's household, was worse than the uncertainty of the frontier. She had not expected Silas Vane. She was not sure what to do with him. "What are my options?" she asked Aldous. "You could return to Greer County with the other women who haven't been matched, or—" "I'll go," she said. Aldous exhaled. "But I want to talk to him first," she added. "Before we leave, not through you." Aldous looked briefly pained by this requirement, but nodded. Chapter 5. She found Silas behind the livery, doing something methodical and mechanical with his pack harnesses by the light of late afternoon. He didn't look up when she approached, but he hadn't been surprised by anyone sneaking up on him since he was 19, so she assumed he'd heard her coming. "Mr. Vane?" "Miss Holloway." She stood a few feet away, watching him work. He was stitching a broken buckle back onto leather, his big hand surprisingly careful with the needle. The work was neat. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "Why me?" He kept stitching for a moment. The needle went in and out. "I told Webb—" "I'm not Webb. I want to know what you actually thought." She kept her voice level. This mattered. She'd made the decision to go, but she wanted to go without illusions about what she was walking into. She'd learned that much in 22 years. Was it pity? Proving a point? Because either of those things I can work with, but I'd like to know. He finished the stitch, tied it off, and looked at her. "Neither," he said. "Then what?" I was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he spoke, it was in that same low, measured voice, and he looked at her directly, which was somehow more uncomfortable than being looked at with contempt. "I've had pity for people," he said. "Looks different. I wasn't pitying you." He set the harness across his knee. "And I'm not interested in proving points to men like Webb. They're not worth the effort." Then, "You stood in that square for 7 hours, he said. "Men laughed at you. You didn't look for sympathy. You didn't make yourself smaller or bigger. You just stood there, like you decided ahead of time what you were willing to accept, and were waiting to see if anything better showed up." He paused. "That's not nothing." Mara was quiet. "The mountain is hard," he continued. "I've had 3 animals die on me in 5 years. I've been snowed in for 2 months at a stretch. The work doesn't stop because you're tired or sick or things aren't going right. I don't need someone who's easy to look at. I need someone who doesn't quit a beat. That's what I saw." She looked at him for a long moment. She didn't feel warm exactly. She didn't feel the thing she'd been told she was supposed to feel when the right situation presented itself. She felt something more practical, a careful, tentative sense that this might actually be what she'd thought it was, and not a new variety of humiliation she hadn't encountered yet. "I don't know how to trap," she said. "I can teach you. I've never been above 3,000 feet. You'll adjust." "I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not what people expect physically. I know that. If that's going to become a problem—" "It's not," he said, simply. without the slightly too fast reassurance that would have made it ring false. She exhaled slowly. "All right," she said. He nodded and went back to his harness. She stood there a moment longer. "Do you always talk this little?" The corner of his mouth moved, almost. "This is actually a lot for me," he said. Chapter 6. They left Cutter's Ford the following morning, before most of the settlement was awake. Mara had one bag, clothes, a small kit of personal items, a book she'd carried from Greer County that she'd read 4 times and still found useful, a folding knife her father had given her when she was 12 and that she'd kept without ever having to use it. It wasn't much. She'd packed light because she'd been told to, and also because what she was leaving hadn't required more than a bag to contain. Silas was already at the livery when she arrived, loading the last of his supplies onto the limping mule, which had recovered sufficiently to travel if they kept an easy pace. He had a second horse, a plain, solid-built bay mare named, he told her without any fanfare, Prospect, that Mara would ride. "Have you ridden much?" he asked, tightening the bay's girth. "Enough," she said. She'd ridden work horses her whole life. Not gracefully, but functionally, which she suspected was more relevant up here. He handed her the reins. She mounted without assistance. It wasn't the most elegant thing she'd ever done, but she made it, and didn't look to see if he was watching to evaluate her. He wasn't. He was already on his own horse, a dark roan with a Roman nose, moving toward the North Trail. They rode out of Cutter's Ford as the sky was going from black to grey. 2 people who'd known each other for less than 24 hours headed into terrain that would take everything they had, with very few words between them and no promises that either of them was entirely sure they could keep. Behind them in the settlement, the gossip had already started taking its final shape, the story that would be told and retold in the trading post and the tavern, simplified and sharpened by repetition until it became a parable of some kind, though people couldn't quite agree on what it was a parable of. Dalton Webb told it as a story about Silas being contrary, choosing wrong on purpose because that's what impossible people did. Reverend Aldous told it as a story about providence, the Lord working in ways too complex for ordinary people to follow. A woman named Cass, who ran the tavern and had watched the whole thing from her window, told it as a story about something she couldn't quite name, which was the closest any of them came to the truth. Mara didn't know any of this. She was already a mile up the North Trail, her eyes on the ridgeline ahead, which was just starting to catch the first pale light of morning. The wind came down off the mountain and hit her in the face, and she pulled her collar up. Cold. It was genuinely, bitterly cold, even in spring. She thought, "I chose this." Then she thought, "I suppose I'd better be right about it." The trail steepened. She shifted her weight in the saddle. Prospect, the horse, solid and patient, climbed without complaint. Ahead of her, not speaking, watching the trail with the careful attention of a man who knew every stone on this path, Silas Vane rode north toward Blackstone Ridge, and whatever came next. Chapter 7. 3 things happened on the 2-day ride to the cabin that were not dramatic in any cinematic sense, but that Mara later recognized as the first real information she'd gathered about the man she'd agreed to go to the mountain with. The first. On the afternoon of the first day, when they stopped to rest the animals at a narrow stream crossing, Silas noticed that the left stirrup on Mara's saddle had been adjusted wrong at the livery, too short, putting her knee at an angle that would have become painful over a long day's ride. He didn't point this out with any fanfare. He simply said, "Hang on," and adjusted it himself, checking the right side too, making the correction without commentary. It had been wrong. Now it was right. He moved on. The second, that night when they made camp in a shallow rock shelter off the trail, he cooked, not elaborately, salt pork, cornbread made in a pan on the fire, coffee so dark and strong it was nearly solid. He set Mara's share in front of her before his own, which she didn't make much of in the moment, but noticed. The third, when she woke in the grey pre-dawn of the second day and found him already awake, sitting at the edge of the shelter with his rifle across his lap and his eyes on the tree line, she asked without quite meaning to, still half asleep, before her internal editor had fully engaged. "Do you actually sleep?" He looked over at her. "A few hours," he said. "Enough." "Do you always watch like that?" Something moved in the trees around midnight. Probably nothing. She sat up and looked at the tree line, seeing only grey shapes in grey light. Probably, could be bear, woke up early from winter. He glanced at her. "Go back to sleep if you want. I'm awake now," she said. So they sat together in the near dark, watching the trees. The fire burned down to coals between them. Neither of them talked. It wasn't the silence of people with nothing to say. It was something else, the silence of people who were still figuring out the geometry of being in proximity to each other, testing whether it was comfortable or not. Mara decided it was, cautiously. More cautious than comfortable, but moving in the right direction. The bear, if it was a bear, didn't come out of the trees. They reached Blackstone Ridge the second afternoon, when the light was going gold and long across the snow. The trail, if you could call it a trail, it was more of a suggestion, a series of markers and remembered paths that Silas navigated without hesitation, climbed steeply for the last 4 miles, switchbacking up through pine forest, and then above the tree line into open rocky terrain, where the wind hit you from all directions and had intentions. Mara had stopped speaking approximately 2 miles back, not from social failure, but because the altitude and the effort of the climb had made a purely functional claim on her lungs. She focused on breathing, on keeping her weight centered in the saddle, on watching Prospect's ears to see if the horse was troubled by anything. She did not look down. The drop off the trail's left edge was significant enough that looking at it served no useful purpose. The cabin appeared without announcement. She came around a bend in the trail behind Silas, and there it was, settled against the granite outcrop, like it had been there since the mountain was young. Logs grey with age and weather, a stone chimney, a small outbuilding, a storage she guessed, or a workshop, connected by a covered walkway, 2 windows, small and deep-set against the cold. It was not charming. It did not have the qualities that a word like homestead conjures in a story told gently. It was a working place, built for survival and nothing else, and it looked exactly like what it was. Mara looked at it for a long moment. Then she swung down from the saddle, less gracefully than she would have liked, her legs stiff from 2 days of riding, and landed on the frozen ground and looked around at the view she had from this height in every direction. Mountains, snow, the dark green stripe of pine forest far below, a sky that was turning colors she'd never had a reason to name. "This is it," Silas said from beside her. Not a question, a statement of fact offered neutrally, giving her room to form whatever opinion she was going to form. "Yes," she said. "I'll show you how the cabin's laid out. Water comes from a spring behind the rock. Line runs inside, so it doesn't freeze through most of winter, but sometimes it does. And then you get water from snow." He started for the cabin, listing these facts with the efficiency of someone covering practical ground. "Firewood is split and stacked on the north side. You'll need to bring in 3 loads a day to keep the cabin at a workable temperature. The outbuilding is where I keep the traps and most of the tools. I'll go over what's there tomorrow." He glanced back at her. "Any questions so far?" "Hundreds," she said honestly, "but I'll start with one. Is the floor level or does it lean?" He paused, looked at her. "Lean slightly to the east," he said. "You get used to it." She nodded. "All right." She followed him inside. The cabin was dim and cold when they entered, the kind of cold that settles into stone and wood over days of the fire being out. Silas went directly to the hearth and started building a fire with the efficiency of a man doing something he'd done 1,000 times. Mara stood just inside the door and took in the space. Smaller than she'd expected, but organized, everything in its place, nothing unnecessary, every surface that wasn't a shelf or a work area kept clear. The books on the shelf surprised her. She'd known about them from the traders' stories, but seeing them here, actual books, not almanacs, actual literature, some of which she recognized, rearranged something in her understanding of Silas Vane. "What are you reading?" she asked. He looked up from the hearth, following her gaze to the shelf. Right now, nothing. Haven't had time since November. He went back to the fire. You can read them if you want. She crossed to the shelf and ran a finger along the spines. A few titles she knew. One she'd read twice and thought about once a week. You've read Montaigne, she said. A pause. The fire caught. 3 times, he said. She turned to look at him, crouching by the hearth, feeding the small flame with careful additions of wood. His face in the firelight was still set in those hard lines, still difficult to read, but there was something in the answer, in the 3 times, that was different from anything she'd gotten from him so far. Me too, she said. He looked up at her then, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't done exactly in all the hours since Cutter's Ford. Not assessing. Something more open than that. What did you make of it? He asked. And so on the first evening on Blackstone Ridge, while the fire built itself in the cold stone hearth and the mountain dark came down outside the small windows, they talked. Not about the cabin or the trapping lines or the practical architecture of a shared life. About Montaigne, about the essays, about the strange honesty of a man 400 years dead, who decided to write about himself with unflinching clarity. It was not what Mara had expected from Silas Vane. It was what she suspected, what Silas Vane had expected from himself either. He sat on the floor by the hearth with his back against the stone and talked in the careful, slightly rusty way of a man who doesn't have many conversations and knows it, and she sat in the cabin's one chair, with her legs pulled up and argued with some of his interpretations, and he argued back. And the fire got hotter and the cabin got warmer, and the mountain wind moved around the outside of the walls like something trying to find a way in. At some point, Silas made more of the terrible coffee, and she drank it without complaint, because the altitude and the cold had earned it. They did not solve anything that night. They did not arrive at any understanding or resolution or the comfortable familiarity that certain stories pretend comes quickly. What they arrived at was something more modest and more durable. The tentative recognition that they were, at minimum, 2 people who could be in the same room without making each other worse. For a first night on an isolated mountain in a cold cabin with a stranger, Mara thought that was enough. Outside, the wind moved. Snow ticked against the small, deep-set windows. Inside, the fire held. Eeg. The first week was an education in discomfort. Mara had told Silas she understood that the mountain life was hard. She'd believed it when she said it. But there's a particular kind of gap between knowing something intellectually and having it demonstrated to you at 5 in the morning, in temperatures that make your face hurt, and that gap was, it turned out, considerable. She woke the first morning to the sound of Silas already moving around the cabin, the fire already built back up, a pot of something already on the hook over the flame. Grey light at the windows, her breath visible. Every muscle in her body had filed a formal complaint about the previous 2 days in the saddle, and her lower back had moved past complaint into outright hostility. She got up anyway. This was not heroism. This was the understanding that staying in the bed would not make any of it better, and she had not come this far to spend her first morning on Blackstone Ridge hiding under a bear hide. Silas was at the workbench when she emerged, studying a map spread flat under a lamp. He glanced up. "Coffee's ready," he said. Then, after a pause that she was beginning to recognize as his version of consideration, "How are you doing?" "I'm standing," she said. "That's something." "It is," he agreed, without any indication of whether he found this funny or just accurate. The coffee was the same impenetrable substance as on the trail. She drank it standing at the window, looking out at a world that was entirely white and grey and enormous, and tried to get her bearings. The days took on a shape quickly. Not a comfortable shape. The word comfortable had no business being applied to anything about Blackstone Ridge in late spring, when the snow was still deep and the wind came off the peaks without apology, but a shape nonetheless. Silas was up before light. He ran his trapping lines in the early morning, which meant a circuit of several miles through terrain that he navigated from memory, checking each trap, resetting what needed resetting, hauling back whatever the night had provided. He did this alone for the first week, which gave Mara time to get her bearings in the cabin, and the immediate area without trying to learn everything at once. She wasn't idle. She wasn't built for idle. The cabin had months of accumulated small disorder, not filth. Silas was not a filthy man, but the particular entropy of a person living alone who has no one else's standards to maintain. Things stored in the wrong places. A water situation that worked but barely. A food organization system that seemed to be primarily put it where there's room. She reorganized methodically, asking before she moved anything significant, getting answers that were usually some variation of doesn't matter, do what makes sense, which she took as genuine permission and not indifference. She cooked. She'd been cooking since she was 9 years old in a household that needed feeding, and she was good at it in the unglamorous way of someone who has cooked under resource constraints their entire life, making something adequate and occasionally better than adequate out of whatever was available. The first meal she made Silas without him asking, a proper stew from the salt pork and dried vegetables in his stores, actually seasoned, actually thickened. He ate half the pot without comment and then said, quietly and without looking up, "That's better than what I usually have." Coming from Silas' vein, she was learning that was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. The tensions crept in sideways, the way they do between people who are still figuring out how to occupy shared space without collision. The first one happened at the end of the second week, when Silas came back from the trap lines to find Mara on the roof of the outbuilding, replacing a section of rotted shingles she'd found in the storage pile. He stood below and looked up at her. She could feel him looking. "What are you doing?" he said. "The east corner is letting water in," she said without stopping what she was doing. "I found the shingles in the back. I know it's letting water in." "Then it needs fixing." "I was going to fix it." "I know," she said, "but I'm up here now." A pause. She kept working. He stood below, and she could sense the specific quality of his silence. Not angry, not precisely, but something adjacent to it. The silence of a man whose domain has been acted upon without consultation. "You could have fallen," he said finally. "I didn't." "The roof is iced in the morning." It's afternoon," she said, "and I checked my footing before I went up." She drove a nail. "I'm not careless, Silas." Another pause. Longer. "I know," he said. Then he went inside. She finished the shingles. When she came down and went into the cabin, he didn't say anything about it again, and the east corner of the outbuilding stopped letting water in. It wasn't an argument exactly, but it was the first time she'd used his given name without thinking about it, and that evening she noticed that he'd noticed. The second friction came from a different direction. At the end of her third week, Silas told her he was going to take her out on the trap lines. Not because he needed help, she understood. He'd been running them alone for years, but because she needed to know where they were and how they worked, and what to do if something happened to him on the mountain. "If something happens to you," she said, pulling on her coat, "what exactly am I supposed to do?" "Depends on what happened," he said. "That's why I'm showing you." The trapline circuit was 7 miles. Over terrain that was, in places, genuinely dangerous. Steep traverses above drop-offs, narrow paths along ridge edges, a section through a ravine where the snow bridged over running water underneath in a way that you had to know about or you'd go through it. Silas walked ahead, pointing things out as they went, and she followed and listened and worked hard to keep the map of it in her head, which had always been good with spatial information, better than most people realized. She kept up. It cost her. Her legs burned on the climbs, and the altitude was still making her lungs work harder than they should have to, and there was one section of the traverse where the drop below was serious enough that she felt the cold finger of something very like fear trace down her spine. But she kept moving. She asked questions when she had questions and was silent when she was processing. At the far end of the circuit, where the line turned back toward the cabin, through a stand of old-growth pine, Silas stopped and checked a trap that had caught a marten. He dispatched it cleanly and efficiently, the way he did everything. No ceremony, no hesitation, just the thing done. Then he showed her how the trap mechanism worked, making her do the reset herself while he watched. Her first attempt was wrong. He corrected her without impatience, just showed her again where her hands needed to be, and she did it correctly the second time. Good, he said. I would like, she said, breathing hard from the climb, to register an objection to the section near the ravine. The bridge crossing? If that's what you call it, I'd call it a trap made of frozen water and optimism. Something moved in his face, the almost smile she was beginning to recognize. It holds, he said. You learn to read the color of the ice. And if you read it wrong, you get wet. He paused, and then cold quickly, which becomes serious. There's a secondary route that avoids it, longer but safer. You should probably take that one when the temperature fluctuates. She looked at him. You could have started with that. I wanted you to see the main route first. He started back toward the cabin. You need to know it exists, even if you don't use it. She followed him. That's a very Silas Vane way to approach things. What does that mean? It means, she said, choosing her words carefully, that you tend to show people the hard version of things first, and then mention the alternatives afterward. He walked in silence for a bit. Is that a criticism? It's an observation. Another silence. Then, fair. She hadn't expected him to concede it, and the surprise must have shown, because he glanced back at her and added, with the particular flat delivery that she'd come to understand was his version of dry humor. I said I don't talk much. I didn't say I wasn't listening. That evening, when they were back in the cabin and the fire was going and supper was done, Mara sat at the workbench with a piece of paper and redrew the trapline circuit from memory. Every fork, every landmark, every section she'd catalogued on the walk. She got most of it right. The ravine section and its secondary route were both there. She showed it to Silas. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up a pencil and added 2 details she'd missed. A secondary cache location and a landmark pine that marked the halfway turn, without any comment about what she'd gotten right. She took the map back and added the corrections. She kept that map folded in her coat pocket from that day on. The community's reaction arrived, as she'd half expected it would, not all at once, but in installments. The first came in the form of a trader named Burrell, who came up the East Pass in mid-spring to buy furs from Silas's early season catch. He was a compact, brisk man in his 50s who'd been dealing with Silas for years and knew better than to be indirect about anything. He was also, Mara gathered, a man who carried information between the settlements the way water carries sediment. It just accumulated in him and came out downstream. He arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday, said his hellos to Silas in the efficient shorthand of men who don't waste words, and then turned to Mara with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. Miss Holloway, he said, you're looking well. Thank you, she said. Coffee, please. She poured it. He sat at the table across from Silas, and the 3 of them navigated the first few minutes of the fur transaction, which Mara stayed for because she wanted to understand how these transactions worked, and sitting through them was the most direct way to learn. After the numbers were settled, Burrell cleared his throat in the way of a man moving from business to something else. People are talking, he said. This appeared to be addressed to Silas, but his eyes moved to Mara briefly. People always are, Silas said. Specifically about the arrangement here. Burrell wrapped his hands around the coffee mug. I'm not saying it as a criticism. I'm saying it because you should know. Webb's been telling anyone who'll listen that you've lost your judgment. Aldous is defending you, which not sure that helps. And there are some men from the south who came through last week asking about land up in this territory. They were also asking about you. Silas was quiet for a moment. What kind of men? The kind that ask about land, like they already know the answer to a question they're pretending to ask. Burrell paused. Came with a man named Pike, Ronan Pike. You know him? Silas's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. A kind of stillness that Mara had not seen before, and that made the back of her neck prickle. I know of him, Silas said. Flat. He's been buying up mountain parcels down south. Timber rights mostly. Couple of trapping territories. Burrell's voice was carefully neutral. He seems to have an interest in Blackstone territory. He can have an interest, Silas said. The land's not available. Burrell nodded slowly, looking at his coffee. He knows you're up here, he asked specifically. Mara sat with this. She watched Silas, who was doing his thing of looking at a fixed point and being very still. She'd been on the mountain long enough to know that Silas being still was not the same as Silas being calm. "What does he want the land for?" she asked. Both men looked at her. Beryl seemed mildly surprised to be addressed, though there was no reason he should have been. "Timber," he said. "The old-growth pine up here is worth considerable money in the lowland markets. There's a mill operation down south that's been expanding." "Silas's trapping lines run through that timber," she said. "Yes," Beryl said, "they do. If the timber goes, the territory goes." Beryl looked at Silas. Something seemed to pass between them. "She follows it quickly," Beryl said. "She does," Silas said. He looked at Mara, and in his face was that thing she'd seen twice before, the open look less guarded than his default. "Pike has tried this before, down in the lower territory. He moves carefully. First he asks questions, then he sends men to survey. Then an offer comes that looks reasonable until you look at what you're actually signing. And if you don't sign?" Silas was quiet. "That's the part nobody has a clean answer to," Beryl said. After Beryl left, the cabin felt different. The threat hadn't materialized into anything specific yet. It was still only a name, a question, the shadow of something that wasn't here yet. But Mara had grown up in a county where she'd watched people lose land and livelihoods to men who moved exactly the way Beryl described. She knew what that shadow meant. She was washing the mugs from the coffee when Silas spoke from behind her. "You don't have to stay involved in this," he said. She turned around. He was at the workbench, but he wasn't working. He was looking at her. "I live here," she said. "I know, but what's coming? If Pike does what he's done before, it won't be clean. I don't want you to think you signed up for this." She studied him. In the weeks she'd spent on this mountain, she had developed a working understanding of the difference between Silas being protective and Silas underestimating her. And the two things wore similar clothing, but felt entirely different from the inside. "What did I sign up for?" she asked. "A beat." "I don't know," he said, "honestly." "Neither do I," she said, "but I'm still here." She put the mug on the shelf. "Tell me about Pike, everything you know." I was quiet for another moment, that considering silence she'd come to wait out without filling. And then he pulled a chair out from the table and sat down and began to talk. It was the most she'd heard him say in one sitting. He spoke in the same measured way he did everything, but without the practiced economy of his usual speech. This came out in longer passages, occasionally doubling back on itself, the way a story told by someone who doesn't tell many stories tends to go. Ronan Pike had come up from the south 5 years ago with money from sources no one had been able to trace cleanly. Had a talent for finding men in weak positions, trappers with bad seasons, homesteaders with broken equipment, anyone behind on their obligations, and making them offers that looked like help until the papers were signed and the trap closed. I was not, as far as Silas knew, a violent man himself. He employed men who handled that end of things. He stayed back and let the mechanics work. "He's never come after your territory before?" Mara asked. "He's looked at it twice from what I've heard. Both times he moved on to somewhere easier." Silas leaned back in his chair. "I've had a good season 2 years running. The timber value up here is higher than it used to be. I think this time he decided the difficulty was worth it." "Because you're here alone." "Was," he said. She looked at him. "You think it matters that I'm here?" "I think Pike makes calculations," Silas said. He looked at this land and saw one man living alone at 4,000 feet who nobody in Cutter's Ford particularly likes. He'd have figured, isolated, no community support, no leverage. He met her eyes. "I don't know if having you here changes his calculation, but it changes mine." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that, and he didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask. She filed it away the way she'd been filing away everything about Silas Vane, carefully, without jumping to conclusions, waiting for the picture to become clearer over time. Outside, the afternoon light was going orange across the snow. The mountain was quiet in the specific way it got quiet in late afternoon, before the wind came back in the evening. In a few months, summer would loosen some of the cold's grip, and the passes would be easier, and whatever Pike was planning would come up those passes with the warmer weather. Mara stood at the window and looked at the ridgeline and did what she was good at, which was thinking. The map of the trapping lines was in her coat pocket. She pulled it out and unfolded it on the table, looking at the terrain she'd been learning. The ravine, the secondary routes, the sections of old-growth pine, the high traverse where you could see the entire eastern approach to the ridge. She began to look at it differently, not as a working route, but as terrain with tactical properties, where a small number of people knew the land and a larger group didn't. She wasn't sure yet what she was thinking toward, but she kept thinking. Silas came to stand beside her, looking at the map. He didn't say anything. The ravine section, she said after a moment. What about it? You said you have to know about it or you go through the ice. Yes. She looked up at him. What if someone who didn't know came through there fast, in the dark or in bad weather? Silas looked at the map. Then he looked at her. His expression had shifted into something she hadn't seen before. Not the almost smile, not the open look. Something more focused. Evaluating, but differently than he'd evaluated her in Cutter's Ford, like he was recalculating something. They'd go through, he said slowly. How bad? Bad enough to stop them. The fire crackled in the hearth. The evening wind was starting up outside. Mara folded the map back along its worn creases and put it in her pocket. Then we should make sure we know every inch of those routes, she said, all of them. Better than anyone who might come up here thinking this mountain belongs to them. Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. You've been thinking about this a while, he said. Since Burrell said the name, she admitted. And before that, she considered the question honestly. Since Cutter's Ford, she said, I came here to find something better than what I had. I'm not interested in losing it. The wind moved around the walls. The fire held its shape. Silas nodded once, the way he did when something had settled into a decision. Tomorrow, he said, I'll show you the eastern approach, the sections they'd have to come through to get here from the valley. All of them? All of them, he said. They spent the next 3 weeks learning the mountain, the way soldiers learn terrain before a battle. Not casually, not for the pleasure of it, but with the specific attention of people who understand that the land itself is the only advantage they have. Silas took her through the eastern approach in sections, the same methodical way he'd shown her the trap lines. The eastern face of Blackstone Ridge was less vertical than the north and west sides, which made it the most logical route for anyone coming up from the valley with equipment or numbers. It was also, by virtue of being more accessible, more dangerous in ways that weren't immediately obvious. False flats that dropped without warning, a long exposed section below the granite shelf where the wind funneled and could knock an unready man sideways, and 2 creek crossings that were manageable in summer and treacherous in the freeze-thaw instability of late spring, when the ice looked solid and wasn't. Mara walked all of it. She walked it in different light and different weather, because Silas told her the mountain looked different under cloud cover, and she needed to know both versions. She walked it until she could have drawn it from memory in the dark, which she actually did. Sitting at the workbench in the evenings with the lamp turned up, adding details to the hand-drawn maps she'd started keeping in a leather-bound notebook she'd found among the cabin stores. The notebook became a project. She mapped not just the routes but the characteristics of each section, where the footing was unreliable, where the terrain forced a single-file approach, where visibility from above was clear and from below was not. She marked the ravine. She marked 3 other spots that had similar properties, where the mountain knew its own secrets, and a person who didn't know them would find that out the hard way. Silas watched this process with the expression he wore when something had shifted beyond his expectations, and he was adjusting without making a performance of adjusting. He added information when she missed something. He stopped correcting her on the things she got right, which was most of them. One evening in early June, he sat across from her while she worked on a section near the northern tree line and said without preamble, "You have a very good memory." "I do," she said, not looking up. She was checking a measurement against an earlier notation, better than good. "My father used to say it was my only reliable feature." She said it without self-pity, just as a fact. I could remember anything I read or heard. He found it useful. Did he say it unkindly? She looked up. Silas was watching her in the careful way he had. Sometimes, she said, depends on the day. She went back to the map. He wasn't a cruel man, just limited in what he thought I was capable of beyond the practical. A pause. Outside, the evening wind was doing its routine sweep around the cabin walls. People underestimated you, Silas said. It wasn't a question. My whole life, she said. Does it still bother you? She thought about it honestly. The way she'd learned to think about things she'd been carrying a long time. Less than it used to, she said. Here, at least, the mountain doesn't have an opinion about what I look like. Something in his face moved, not the almost smile, something more serious. Neither do I, he said, in case that wasn't clear. She met his eyes. It's getting clearer, she said. They held that for a moment, the kind of moment that doesn't resolve into anything, just sits there between two people and means something that neither of them is ready to name yet. Then Silas stood and went to check the fire, and Mara went back to her map, and the evening continued. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday, announced by nothing except the sound of horses on the eastern approach. Silas heard it first. He always heard things first, some combination of the stillness he lived in and the hair-trigger awareness the mountain had built into him over 12 years. He was at the workbench when his head came up. Mara was near the hearth, reading. She looked at him and read his expression and set the book down without a word. He went to the window. She went to the other window, the smaller one that faced east. 3 horses, 3 men, coming up the last section of the eastern approach at a pace that said they weren't worried about announcing themselves. Do you recognize them? She said quietly. The one in front. Silas's voice was level, but tight in the way a rope gets tight before it breaks. Colm Decker. He works for Pike. The name landed between them with weight. Silas took his rifle from the wall. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way you take a tool when you might need it, and went to the door. He opened it and stepped out onto the narrow porch and stood there with the rifle, not raised but also not invisible, and waited. Mara stayed just inside the door frame, close enough to hear, far enough back that she wasn't framed in the opening. The 3 men pulled up about 20 feet from the cabin. The one in front, Decker, a narrow-faced man in his 40s with the kind of tan that came from spending a lot of time outside in other people's business, raised a hand in the universal gesture of benign greeting, which it wasn't. Vane, he said. Good afternoon. Decker. Silas didn't move. Nice day up here. Decker looked around at the ridge with the expression of a man doing appraisal. Quiet. That's why I'm here. Decker smiled without warmth. Mr. Pike wanted me to come up and introduce ourselves properly. We've been in the territory a few weeks now, getting the lay of things. He paused, and his eyes moved past Silas to the doorframe where Mara was standing. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, quickly rearranged into something more calculated. He'd been told, she guessed, that Silas lived alone. Didn't know you had company. She's not company, Silas said. She lives here. Decker absorbed this. Well, he recovered smoothly. Mr. Pike thought it might be worth having a conversation about the territory up here. He's a reasonable man, likes to do things the civil way. Before he stopped himself. He'd like to make an offer. Fair market for the trapping rights and timber access on the northern and eastern sections. I've heard about Pike's offers, Silas said. Not interested. Now Vane, not interested. The second of the 3 men, younger, broader, positioned slightly to Decker's right, in a way that wasn't accidental, shifted in his saddle. Silas's eyes moved to him briefly and then back to Decker. The thing is, Decker said, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man who has delivered bad news before and developed a method for it. This territory is going to develop whether you're cooperative or not. Mr. Pike has friends in the county registrar's office. There are some questions about the original claim on this land. That the claim is sound, Silas said. I filed it 12 years ago. It's been renewed twice. Of course. Decker's smile stayed fixed. But questions have a way of taking time to resolve, and in the meantime, operations tend to. complicate. He looked around at the ridge again, at the outbuilding, at the trapping line markers visible from the porch. It's a difficult life up here. Without clear title, it gets more difficult. This was the offer and the threat simultaneously, packaged together the way Park apparently liked to do things. Silas was quiet for a long moment. His expression didn't change in any way Mara could have described precisely, but something in the quality of his stillness had shifted. The stillness of a man who has made a decision and is now simply waiting for the conversation to catch up to it. "You have your answer," Silas said. "Take it back to Pike." Decker held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, clicked his horse around, and the three of them rode back down the eastern approach the way they'd come. Silas watched them until they were below the granite shelf and out of sight. Then he came inside. "Well," Mara said. "Well," he agreed. He put the rifle back on the wall, though she noticed he checked the load first. "Questions about the claim," she said. "It's what he does. Creates doubt, ties things up in paperwork while his men work around the edges." He sat down at the table. "I've seen it happen to 2 other men in this territory." "What happened to them?" A pause. "One left. The other held on but lost his trapping access. Park's men disrupted his lines until the season was worthless." He looked at his hands on the table. Neither of them had done anything wrong. It didn't matter. Mara sat down across from him. "Do you have the original claim paperwork?" "Yes." "I want to see it." He looked at her. "If he's going to attack the claim, we need to know what's there," she said. "Every detail, where it's solid and where it might have language he could use." He went to the shelf behind the workbench, moved aside a row of books, and pulled out a flat tin box. He set it on the table in front of her. She opened it. The papers were there. Original filing documents, renewal records, survey maps from 12 years ago. She read carefully, the way she read everything, which was slowly and completely. Silas sat across from her and was quiet, which she appreciated. 20 minutes later, she looked up. "The northern boundary," she said. "It's described by reference to a survey marker. Is the marker still there?" Silas hesitated. "I think so. I haven't checked it in." "We need to check it." She tapped the document. "If the marker's moved or been removed, the boundary becomes disputable. It's the weakest point in the filing." She looked at him. "That's where he'll go." Silas looked at the papers and then at her. She could see him recalculating something. "You read legal documents before?" "My uncle lost a property dispute when I was 14, she said. "I read everything afterward, trying to understand how it happened. I couldn't fix it, but I learned what to look for." He was quiet for a moment. "We'll check the marker tomorrow morning." "Good." She closed the tin box. "And we need to tell Burrell. Next time he comes through, if Pike is working through the county registrar, there may be someone in the valley who can push back on that side." "I don't like asking for help," Silas said. It came out flat, a statement of fact rather than pride. "I know," she said, equally flat. "Do it anyway." He looked at her for a moment, then with the particular quality he had of conceding things without ceremony, "All right." The survey marker was where it should have been, a notched iron post set in a cairn of stones on the northern ridge boundary, exactly as described in the original filing. But when Mara crouched down and looked at the cairn, she found that 3 of the stones had been recently disturbed, not moved significantly. Just enough to suggest that someone had been here and looked at the post, handling the stones and replacing them without quite getting it right. She looked up at Silas. He crouched beside her and looked at the disturbed cairn and said nothing for a moment. "Decker's men," she said, "or someone working ahead of them." He looked at the post itself. It was solid. The iron hadn't moved. But the stones could be taken down. The post could be pulled or damaged or obscured. "They've been up here before this week," he said, and the low, even quality of his voice had something underneath it she hadn't heard before, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, but carried the weight of both. "They're not trying to resolve this quickly," she said. "They're setting up, making sure they have options." She stood up and looked out over the northern approach, the direction anyone coming from that angle would have to take. Dense pine forest in the middle section, then a long open traverse above the tree line, then the ridge. Good sight lines from above, restricted approach, A person who knew the terrain had significant advantages over a group who didn't. She pulled her notebook from her coat and made a notation. Silas watched her. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Adding this location," she said, "and noting the sightlines." She finished and put the notebook away. "If they come back to this marker with tools, we'd see them from the high traverse before they got here." He looked at the traverse, then at her. "You've been thinking about this strategically." "Yes," she said simply. "Since when?" "Since the map," she said, "since we started walking the approaches." She looked at him directly. "Silas, they have money and they have men. We have this mountain and we know it better than anyone who could come up those approaches. That's not nothing, but we have to actually use it." The wind moved across the ridge and hit them both. Mara's coat was good but not perfect, and she felt the cold in her back where the wind found a gap. Silas was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the open look, not the evaluating look, but something that combined them with something else. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like he was making a decision about trust. "I need to go down to Cutter's Ford," he said. "Talk to Burrell in person. There's a man there, a land agent named Greer, who has dealt with Pike's paperwork moves before." He paused. "It'll be 2 days there and 2 days back, minimum." She understood immediately what he was not quite asking. "How long until you could go?" 3 days of preparation. I need to secure the trapping lines, winterize the outbuilding for a potential absence." He looked at the horizon, calculating. "I'd leave at dawn on Sunday, then go Sunday," she said. "You'd be here alone." "I'm aware." "Decker knows you're here now. If Pike decides to move while I'm—" "Silas." She said his name in the way she'd learned stopped him, the way a firm hand on a door stops it from closing. "I know the routes, I know the terrain, I have the maps and I have the rifle and I know how to use it." She met his eyes. "I'm not fragile." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind had died down slightly, and in the quiet she could hear the distant sound of a creek somewhere below the tree line, still running despite the cold. "I know you're not," he said. And then, because he was Silas and he didn't add things for comfort but only when they were true, he added, "That's not what I'm worried about." She held that. "What are you worried about?" He took a moment. "There are 3 of them that we've seen. If Pike decides to send more, if they come when you're on the lines or in the outbuilding, away from the rifle, then I use what I know," she said. "The terrain is the advantage, Silas. You said it yourself. They don't know where the ice is thin. They don't know which routes dead end. I do." She held his gaze. "Don't make the mistake of thinking that because I can't outfight 3 men, I can't handle 3 men." He was quiet for a long moment. "Decker called you company," he said finally, not the point she'd expected him to land on. "I noticed. He thought you'd be easy to dismiss." His jaw tightened fractionally. "Men like him. Pike's men, they see what they expect to see. A woman on a mountain, assume she's out of her element, assume she's not a variable worth accounting for." "Good," Mara said. He looked at her. "That's useful," she said. "If he's not accounting for me, then I'm not something he's prepared for." Something in Silas's face settled, a tension she hadn't entirely recognized as tension until it released. He nodded once. "Sunday," he said. "Sunday," she agreed. She stood on the northern ridge for another moment, looking at the notched iron post in its disturbed cairn. Below her, the mountain fell away in long forested slopes toward the valley where Pike was making his plans and running his calculations. She pulled out the notebook and added one more notation: the sightline from the high traverse to this exact spot, and the time it would take to cover the distance between them at a hard walk. 40 minutes. Less if she knew exactly where she was going. She knew exactly where she was going. She put the notebook away and followed Silas back toward the cabin, her boots finding the frozen path without hesitation. The mountain was cold and difficult, and it had nearly broken her 6 times in the past 2 months, and she knew it was capable of worse. It was also, she had come to understand, entirely on her side. If she was willing to learn its language, she was. Silas left on Sunday before the sky had decided what color it was going to be. Mara stood on the porch and watched him go. the dark roan picking its way down the eastern approach with the careful certainty of an animal that knew this path well. Silas, a solid shape against the grey dawn, not looking back. She told him not to. Not out of sentiment, but out of practicality, looking back on a mountain trail when the light was poor and the footing uncertain was how people got hurt. He'd understood that immediately, which was one of the things about Silas she'd come to appreciate. He understood the difference between sentiment and reason, and when she spoke the latter, he didn't argue. She stood there until the sound of the horse faded below the granite shelf. Then she went inside, built the fire up properly, drank her coffee standing at the window, and started making her list. She'd been making lists her whole life. It was how she managed things too large to hold in her head all at once. Break them into components, assign order, work through them. Her father had called it her ledger mind. Her mother had called it obsessive. Mara had always thought it was simply the most efficient way to not be overwhelmed by the size of things. The list for today: check the eastern trap lines, clear the snow from the outbuilding roof before the afternoon melt made it unstable, confirm the survey marker on the northern boundary was still untouched, review the claim documents again for anything she might have missed the first time. She did all of it. The trap lines first, in the early morning when the light was clean and the cold was honest rather than treacherous. 3 of the traps had caught, 2 marten and a fox, and she handled them the way Silas had shown her, without flinching and without hurrying. The processing took time. She was still slower than him at it, but she was no longer uncertain, which was the more important variable. The outbuilding roof took an hour and a half, shoveling from the ladder in the kind of cold that made the shovel handle feel like it was made of something living and hostile. She finished it and her shoulders ached, and her fingers were numb inside her gloves, and she counted both of these as acceptable. The survey marker was still where it should be. She looked at the cairn stones and found them undisturbed from how she'd left them. She'd restacked them deliberately in a pattern she'd remember, so she'd know if anyone had been back. They hadn't. Not yet. The claim document she read a 3rd time by lamplight, more slowly than the first 2 readings, making notes in the margins of a separate sheet of paper. The northern boundary language was still the weakest point, but she'd found something else on this read, a rite of passage clause in the original filing that was ambiguous enough to be interpreted 2 ways. Silas had probably never needed to think about it. Burrell's land agent, Greer, would know what it meant in practice. She added it to the notes she'd prepared for Silas to take to Cutter's Ford, even though he was already gone. She'd tell him when he came back. She went to sleep that first night alone on the mountain without ceremony, because there was nothing ceremonial about exhaustion. The 2nd day passed it the same way. The 3rd. She settled into the rhythm of the work without Silas there to set the pace, which meant she set her own pace, which turned out to be somewhat different from his. She worked later in the evenings, organized by lamplight, thought through things on paper rather than sitting still with them in her head. She read more. She slept lighter than she had when he was there, which she noticed but didn't assign too much meaning to. On the 4th day, they came. She was on the high traverse, the long open section above the tree line on the eastern face, where the sight lines were clear in all directions, when she saw the horses below, not 3 this time, 5, coming up the eastern approach in the mid-morning, moving with more purpose than Decker's first visit. They weren't announcing themselves this time. She pressed herself against the rock face instinctively and watched, counting. 5 horses, 5 men. Decker was in front again. She recognized his narrow silhouette even at this distance. The man to his left was bigger than anyone she'd seen on the ridge before, broad through the chest, moving with the deliberate ease of someone who was used to being the largest and most threatening presence in any given situation. She had the rifle. She was above them, which meant she had the height and the sight lines. She also had, and this mattered more, the map in her head. She turned and moved, not back toward the cabin. That was where they were going. She went perpendicular to the approach, cutting across the traverse and down the pine-covered northern slope, moving fast along a route she'd walked enough times that her feet knew the footing without her having to look down. She was going to the ravine. The ravine was 20 minutes at a hard walk from the point on the eastern approach where the trail narrowed before the final climb to the cabin. Anyone coming up that trail would have to pass through the narrow section, which funneled them single file, which removed the advantage of numbers. She moved. The cold hit her in the face, and she breathed through it and kept moving. The slope was steep enough in sections that she had to use her hands, grabbing at pine trunks and rock edges to control her descent. She fell once, caught herself on a root, knee hitting ice-covered rock, hard enough that pain shot up her thigh. She got up and kept going. 15 minutes. She was at the ravine crossing, the ice bridge that Silas had shown her on her first week. The one she'd called a trap made of frozen water and optimism was still intact, still looked solid from the approach. A person who didn't know would walk onto it without hesitation because it looked exactly like the rest of the trail. She crossed it the safe way, the way Silas had shown her, angling to the left where the ice was actually thick, moving quickly and not stopping. On the other side she found her position, a rock shelf above and behind the crossing point, screened by a stand of young pine, with a clear view of the approach. Anyone coming up the main trail toward the cabin would cross directly below her. She settled in and waited. She was not calm. Her knee was throbbing where she'd hit the rock. Her hands inside her gloves were cold beyond the usual cold, and there was a vibration in her chest that she recognized as the physical manifestation of being very afraid and doing the thing anyway. She breathed deliberately, the way she'd learned to breathe at altitude, slow through the nose, filling the bottom of the lungs first. It helped marginally. 12 minutes later she heard them. Voices first. Men's voices carrying in the cold air. Then the sound of horses on frozen ground, the particular crunch of iron shoes on packed snow. They came around the bend below the ravine crossing in single file as she'd known they would, Decker at the front. She waited. Decker's horse stepped onto the ice bridge. It held. She'd known it would. It was solid ice, thick enough to take a horse's weight. She hadn't come here to drop them through the ice. She'd come here because this was the narrowest point of the approach, the point where 5 men on horseback became a single file line with no room to spread out, and the rock walls on either side funneled sound and made the source of a voice impossible to locate precisely. She stood up on the rock shelf and spoke loudly, clearly, aiming her voice at the stone wall so it bounced. "Stop where you are." 5 horses stopped. 5 men looked around trying to place her. She was above and behind them, screened by the young pines, and the acoustics of the ravine made her voice come from everywhere and nowhere. "Who's up there?" Decker called out. His voice was controlled, but she caught the edge in it. She didn't answer. She shifted position on the shelf, moving quietly to the right, and spoke again from the new position. "You're on private land. The claim is filed with the county registrar, and it's been renewed twice. You have no legal authority here." She watched Decker scan the walls above him. He still couldn't find her. "Miss Holloway," he said, and his voice had shifted. He'd figured out who was up there, and with that figuring came a recalibration she could hear. He hadn't expected her. He was deciding whether this changed things. "We're just passing through. We'd like to speak with Mr. Vane." "He's not here." A beat. She watched the men exchange looks below her. The big man to Decker's left was looking at the walls with more systematic attention than the others. He'd find her eventually if she stayed still. She moved again, quietly. "Position 3 further along the shelf." "We'll wait for him then," Decker said. "You'll wait in the valley," she said. "This approach is closed." "Now, miss, there's no need for—" "I have a rifle and I'm above you," she said. "This is not a complicated situation." The big man had found her. She saw his head stop moving. She made eye contact with him across 30 feet of frozen air, and she didn't look away, and she did not shift the rifle in a way that was threatening, not because she was backing down, but because she thought about this. A shot fired here would be heard for miles. It would also, more importantly, be the end of negotiation and the beginning of something she was not certain she could finish alone. What she needed was for them to leave. Not to escalate to the point where leaving became impossible. "Decker," the big man said quietly. Decker looked at him. "She's got the high ground," the big man said, "and we're bunched up." He said it with a flatness that suggested he was assessing the situation rather than expressing concern, which was somehow more unnerving than concern would have been. This isn't the time. Decker was quiet for a moment. Mara watched his jaw work. Below him, the horse shifted on the ice, and he steadied it with a slight pressure on the reins. "We'll come back," he said. Not to her, to the big man. Then he raised his voice. "We'll be in touch, Miss Holloway, when Mr. Vane returns." He turned his horse. The others followed, backing and turning in the narrow space of the ravine, with the awkward, compressed energy of men and animals in a space too small for comfort. They rode back down the approach. She didn't move until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down on the rock shelf slowly, and her legs were shaking, not violently, just the fine tremor of muscles that had been held very still under a very large amount of tension for too long. Her knee hurt badly now that the adrenaline was stepping back. She looked at it. The trousers were torn over the kneecap, and the skin underneath was scraped open, oozing slowly. She sat there for a few minutes, just sat. Then she got up and went back to the cabin. She was at the workbench that evening, cleaning the rifle and documenting everything that had happened in as much detail as she could remember. The number of men, their positions, what Decker had said, what the big man had said, and how he'd said it, when she heard the horse on the eastern approach. One horse. The pattern of hoofbeats she recognized. She was at the door when Silas came around the last turn of the trail, the roan moving with the tiredness of an animal that had covered a lot of ground. Silas himself looked like a man who had slept badly and ridden hard, which she recognized because it was how she looked most mornings on this mountain. He saw her standing in the doorway and pulled up. "You're all right," he said. Not a question exactly. Something between relief and confirmation. "They came," she said, "Decker and 4 others, yesterday morning." He dismounted without a word and tied the roan at the rail. He came up to the porch and stood there looking at her face and at the torn knee of her trousers and then back at her face. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it in order, with the same precision she'd used in her written account. She didn't minimize and she didn't dramatize. She described the ravine crossing, the position on the shelf, what she'd said and how she'd said it and how they'd responded. She described the big man and his assessment of the situation. She told him what Decker had said when they left. When she finished, Silas was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at her with the open expression, more open than she'd seen it before, the walls that were usually there reduced to something lower and less complete. "The ravine position," he said, "that was good thinking." "It was your terrain," she said. "I just used it." "It's our terrain," he said. She held that. "Greer has the paperwork," Silas continued, "the right of passage clause. I told him about it. He thinks it actually works in our favor on the northern boundary, if you read it the way the original survey intended. He's filing a formal clarification with the county registrar this week that should take away Pike's main line of attack on the claim." "I found the same clause," she said. "I was going to tell you when you got back." Something moved in his face. "I know," he said. "Burrell said you'd probably see it. He said—" He stopped. "What?" "He said you were sharper than most land agents he'd worked with." Silas said it without the slightly awkward quality that compliments sometimes had from him, which meant he'd had time to decide he meant it. He wasn't wrong. She looked at him for a moment. Her knee hurt and she was tired, and she'd spent 4 days alone on this mountain, with one of those days being the most frightening of her life, and Silas was standing on the porch looking at her like she was something he hadn't entirely expected, and was still deciding what to do about it. "Decker said they'd come back," she said, "when you were here." "They will." His voice went flat in the way it did when he was settling into something difficult. "Pike doesn't stop after one refusal. He'll come himself next time, or he'll send men with a different kind of authority." He paused. "Greer is working on the legal angle, but that takes time, and in the meantime, we need to make this harder," she said. "The approach, I've been thinking about the access points." She pushed the door open. "Come inside, I'll show you on the map." He followed her in. The cabin was warm. She'd kept the fire properly banked, which was one of the first things she'd learned, and that he'd now stopped checking on, which she took as meaningful. He sat across from her at the table, and she spread the notebook map between them and started talking through what she'd been working out. They talked for 2 hours. Not about Pike specifically, but about the mountain, which approaches were defensible, which weren't, where additional deterrents could be placed, what early warning looked like from the high traverse. Silas knew things about the terrain she hadn't found yet. She'd mapped connections between routes that he'd travelled separately and never thought to link. Between the two versions of the mountain in their heads, something more complete emerged. At some point Silas made food, not elaborately, the same salt pork and cornbread as always, and they ate while they talked. The lamp was turned up. Outside, the mountain settled into its late evening quiet. She was looking at the ravine section on the map when she said, without planning to, "I was afraid yesterday." He looked up. "In the ravine, when they were below me." She kept her eyes on the map. "My legs were shaking after they left. I wanted to say that in case you thought I wasn't." "I knew you were," he said. She looked up. "How?" "Because you're not an idiot." He held her gaze. "Fear is appropriate when 5 men come to take your land and you're the only one there to say otherwise." A pause. "Doing it anyway is the part that matters." She thought about what he'd told her in the livery at Cutter's Ford, what felt like a different lifetime. "I need someone who doesn't quit." She understood now what he'd meant by it in a way she hadn't then. Not that he'd needed someone durable in the abstract, but that he'd needed someone who could sit in a ravine with shaking legs and a rifle and hold the line anyway. She hadn't known she was that person yet, that day in the square. She was beginning to understand that she had been for longer than she'd realized. "There's something else," she said. She reached into her coat and pulled out the folded sheet of notes she'd made during her 3rd reading of the claim documents. "The northern boundary language, I want to go through it with you again, because there's a section about the measurement reference that I think could be anchored more clearly if we got a new survey done before Pike's people get to the registrar first." Silas took the paper and read it. She watched his face, the careful focus of a man working through something, following her notes in the margin. He was not a fast reader in the sense of skimming. He read the way she did, completely. "This would take a surveyor coming up the mountain," he said. "Yes. Greer knows men who do this work." "I know. We'd need to get word to him before he finalizes the filing, so the clarification can reference a fresh survey rather than the old markers." She paused. "It would cost money." "I have money," he said. "I know. I just wanted to be clear about what I'm proposing." He looked at her over the paper. "You're proposing we get ahead of Pike on the legal angle and close the boundary question before he can open it." "Yes," she said, "while simultaneously making the physical approaches harder to use without our knowledge." "Yes. Two-front problem," he said. "We're 2 people," she said. "Seems appropriate." He held the paper for another moment, looking at her notes. His handwriting in the margins was precise and small. Hers was looser, faster, occasionally circling back to an earlier point with an arrow. 2 different minds working over the same terrain. He set the paper down. "Write up the surveyor request tonight," he said. "I'll ride back down to Burrell's in the morning and have him relay it to Greer." "You just got back," she said. "I know." He didn't make anything of it. "This is more important than a night's sleep." She nodded. She pulled the paper back and began drafting the surveyor request at the bottom, in the tight space below her notes. The cabin was quiet. The fire held. Outside, the mountain was doing what the mountain did, indifferent to Pike, indifferent to legal filings, indifferent to the small human calculations being made inside a cabin against its granite flank. But the people inside were not indifferent, and on this mountain Mara had learned that made all the difference. Silas rode back down to Burrell's before sunrise, and Mara spent the morning doing what she'd been doing for weeks, working, thinking, and refusing to let the waiting become paralysis. The surveyor request went out through Burrell to Greer, and the reply came back within 4 days. A man named Aldridge, who did boundary work throughout the Upper Territory, would make the ride up to Blackstone Ridge the following week. The fee was significant. Silas paid it without comment when he returned, which was how he handled most things that cost more than he wanted to spend. Not by pretending it didn't cost, but by deciding the expense was justified and then not revisiting the decision. Aldridge arrived on a Thursday. He was a small, weathered man in his 60s who moved through difficult terrain with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had spent 40 years doing exactly this, and who had no patience for anyone who wasted his time with imprecision. He reviewed the original claim documents, walked the northern boundary line in its entirety, with Silas and Mara both present, and spent 2 hours at the survey marker with instruments that Mara watched carefully, learning the process. When he was done, he sat at the cabin table with his field book open and said, "The boundary is clean." Better than clean. The original filer knew what he was doing. The marker placement is legally unambiguous if you reference the survey I'll file. He looked at Mara's annotated copy of the claim documents. "You found the right of passage clause." "I did," she said. "It reads against you superficially," he said, "but it references a different parceling system than the one Pike's people would use to challenge it. Greer's clarification, combined with this new survey, will close the door." He closed his field book. "Whoever's coming after this land is going to find out it's a wall they can't go through." After Aldridge left, Mara stood at the window for a long time. Silas came to stand beside her. "The legal angle is closed," she said. "For now," he said. "You think he'll try something else?" "Pike doesn't stop because a legal strategy failed," Silas said. "He stops when the cost of continuing is higher than the value of what he's after." He looked out at the ridge. "We've made the legal cost high. We haven't made the other kind high enough yet." She knew he was right. She'd known it since the ravine, since she'd watched Decker turn his horses around and heard the calculation in his voice when he said, "We'll come back." The filing with the county registrar would slow Pike. It wouldn't stop him. "He'll come himself," she said. "Not Decker, Pike." "Probably." "When?" Silas thought about it. "Before summer fully opens the passes. He wants to move before the season makes resupply easy for us and harder to disrupt." She nodded. "Then we have 2, maybe 3 weeks. She went to the workbench and opened her notebook. The maps were there, refined over the past month into something that bore very little resemblance to the rough sketches she'd started with. Every approach, every choke point, every section of terrain that favored the person who knew it over the person who didn't. She'd been thinking about something for a week. She'd been holding it, examining it from different angles, checking it for flaws. She thought it was right. She wasn't completely certain, and the uncertainty mattered because Silas was going to be the one taking the most direct risk. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." He sat. She spread the main map between them and put her finger on the eastern approach. Not the ravine section, but the long exposed traverse below the granite shelf. The section where the wind funneled and a mounted group had no cover and nowhere to maneuver quickly. "If Pike comes with enough men to matter," she said, "he'll come up this approach in a group. He has to. The northern and western faces are too steep for horses with equipment. The eastern approach is the only practical route." She traced the trail with her finger. "He knows we know he's coming. He's not trying to surprise us anymore. He's trying to arrive with enough force that surprise is irrelevant." "Yes," Silas said. "So we don't try to stop him on the approach." She moved her finger up to the granite shelf, the high ground above the trail. "We let him come all the way up. We let him get to the cabin." Silas looked at her. "If he comes to the cabin and finds it empty," she continued, "he has 2 options. He can damage the property, which makes him legally liable for destruction of a valid claim, and gives Greer exactly the kind of actionable evidence that gets a territorial judge involved. Or he leaves, having accomplished nothing, and the cost of the trip goes on his ledger." She looked at Silas. "Either way, we're on the high ground, literally, and he's exposed." "And where are we?" he said, "while he's at the empty cabin?" She moved her finger to the traverse above. "Here, both of us, above the trail, with sightlines to the cabin and to every exit route on the eastern face." Silas was quiet, studying the map. "He'll know we're watching," she said. "That's the point. He comes all this way, up a hard mountain with his men and his plans, and he finds an empty cabin and 2 people watching him from the high ground who have done everything legally right and physically right, and who are clearly prepared to keep doing it indefinitely." She paused. Pike makes calculations. We change the calculation. If he decides the watching is provocation enough to act on, then we have the ground and he's in the open on a traverse he doesn't know. She met his eyes. I'm not saying there's no risk. I'm saying this is the version where we use everything we have. Silas looked at the map for a long time. She let him. This was the thing about working with Silas. He didn't make decisions fast, but when he decided, he meant it. And she'd learned that the time he took thinking was not time wasted. The section above the granite shelf, he said finally. The wind comes from the northwest in the afternoon. I know, we'd need to be positioned before noon. Cold up there. Yes, he looked at her. You're sure about this? No, she said. I'm as sure as I can get with incomplete information about what Pike will actually do. She held his gaze. But I think it's right. He nodded. Then we prepare. Pike came on a Tuesday, 11 days after Aldridge's visit. She saw them from the high traverse in the early morning. More than she'd expected, 7 horses on the eastern approach, moving with the deliberate pace of a group that had made a decision and was executing it. She counted twice to make sure. 7. The man she didn't recognize at the front she assumed was Pike. He was middle-aged, compact, moving with the seated authority of a man accustomed to having his presence resolve situations. He rode without urgency. That was the tell. He'd planned this. He'd brought enough men that he felt the outcome was already determined, and he was simply delivering that outcome to the mountain. Silas was beside her, flat against the granite face above the traverse, positioned where he'd be invisible from below unless someone was looking for exactly this. He'd already seen them. 7, she said quietly. Pike's the one in front, he said. I've seen him once, years ago. That's him. He brought numbers. He's done this before. He thinks numbers end the conversation before it starts. Below them, 7 horses climbed the approach. The wind came off the northwest face and cut across the traverse, and Mara pressed closer to the granite and breathed slowly and waited. They let them come all the way up, past the ravine, past the narrowing, all the way to the final climb to the cabin. She heard Decker's voice first, something she couldn't make out, and then Pike's, lower, equally indistinct. The sound of horses on frozen ground near the cabin, the particular acoustic of men dismounting in an open space. Silence for a moment. Then voices again, with the specific tone of men who have arrived somewhere and found it not as expected. She looked at Silas. He was watching the cabin clearing below, his expression flat and still. Then she stood up. She stood up on the granite shelf, fully upright, fully visible against the grey sky. And she looked down at the 7 men in the clearing beside the empty cabin, and she waited. It took 30 seconds for one of them to look up. Then they all looked up. She didn't speak. She didn't raise the rifle. She just stood there in full view with the entire mountain behind her and the eastern approach at her back. And she looked down at Ronan Pike and his 7 men, as if she'd been there for a long time and planned to be there for considerably longer. Silas stood up beside her. 2 people against a granite sky. Below them, 7 men, and the long, hard approach they'd just climbed, and the longer, harder question of what they were willing to do next. Pike looked up at them for a long moment. At this distance, she couldn't read his face. She could read his posture, the very slight shift of a man recalculating. Then Decker said something to him, low and close. She watched Pike's head turn, watched him respond. Watched the conversation happen without being able to hear it, which was almost worse than hearing it because her imagination was trying to fill in the content. The big man, the one from the ravine who'd assessed the situation and told Decker it wasn't the time, was looking at her specifically, not at Silas, at her. And whatever he was seeing, he said something to Pike with a slight tilt of his head toward the traverse, toward the approaches, toward the terrain that she and Silas were standing above, and that his men were currently standing in the middle of. Pike stood still for another long moment. Then he walked to the cabin door. He tried it. It was barred from inside, which she'd done before they left. He stood there with his hand on the door for a moment, and even from this height she could see something in the set of his shoulders that was the body language of a man arriving at an unwelcome conclusion. He turned and walked back to his horse. "Decker," he said, and this she could hear because his voice carried differently when he was giving direction. Flatter, cleaner. "We're done here." Decker looked up at the granite shelf one more time, then he mounted. 7 men, 7 horses, back down the eastern approach, single file through the ravine, the sound of them receding as the mountain swallowed the distance. She stood on the shelf until she couldn't hear them any more. Then her legs made the same decision they'd made in the ravine. The fine trembling of muscles held past their natural limit, and she sat down on the cold granite and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Silas sat down beside her, not touching, just near. "He's not done," he said after a while. "I know," she said, "but he's done with this approach." His voice was quiet, carrying the weight of a man who had lived long enough with difficult things to know the difference between finished and merely interrupted. "He'll try the legal angle again, differently. Greer will have to watch for it." "Then Greer will watch for it," she said, "and we'll keep building the record. Every visit, every attempt, everything documented." She looked at her hands on her knees. "He needs this to be easy. We make it hard every time. At some point the cost outweighs the value." "Could take a year," Silas said. "Could, or longer." "Yes." She looked out at the eastern face, the long slope down to the valley where Pike was somewhere on the trail, riding back to his money and his plans and his next calculation. "Does that bother you?" Silas thought about it in the honest way he thought about things. "A year ago, yes," he said. "I'd have found it wearing. Holding something against pressure that long, alone." She looked at him. "I'm not alone anymore," he said. It was not delivered as a romantic statement. It was delivered the way Silas delivered true things. Plainly, because plain was the only delivery he trusted. That changes what feels sustainable. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the shelf and she pulled her collar up. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "You don't owe me anything." "Not a debt," he said. "Something I should have said." He was looking out at the ridge rather than at her, which was how he talked about things that cost him something. "In Cutter's Ford. When I chose you, you asked me why, and I told you what was true as far as it went. But there was something else." She waited. "I'd been watching that square for an hour before I walked over," he said. "I watched every woman in that line. I watched how they handled the situation, the men, the looking, the comments. Most of them were performing something, trying to be what they thought was wanted, which is understandable. That's what the situation called for." He paused. "You weren't performing. You were just enduring it, exactly as you were. And I thought, that's someone who already knows who she is, who stopped asking permission for it." He finally looked at her. The open expression, more open than she'd ever seen it, the walls almost entirely down. "I don't meet many people like that," he said. "I've never been able to explain why it mattered to me as much as it did. I'm still not sure I can." Mara looked at him for a long time. There was a version of this moment that would have felt like the answer to something, the resolution, the warmth, the thing you wait for. And parts of it did feel that way, but mostly what she felt was something more complex and more durable. The recognition of being understood by someone who didn't understand many people. The specific weight of that. "I knew who I was," she said finally. "I didn't think it was going to matter to anyone." "It matters," he said. She looked back at the ridge. "You're very difficult to read, Silas." "I know. I've been reading you for months." "I know," he said again. And then with the barely there quality of the thing she'd come to recognize as his version of warmth. "You're getting better at it." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "High praise." "It is," he said, seriously. They sat on the granite shelf for a while longer than was practical, given the cold and the wind and the 2-hour walk back to the cabin. Neither of them was in a particular hurry to move. The mountains spread out below them in every direction. The eastern face, the pine forest, the long bare traverses, the ravine with its ice bridge that looked solid and wasn't. All the terrain they'd walked together, argued over maps of, catalogued and planned and defended. It wasn't settled exactly. Pike wasn't gone. The legal file at the county registrar was an open question. The year ahead was going to have more Tuesdays like this one, more calculations to counter, more cold mornings with the rifle and the notebook and the high ground. But Mara sat on the cold granite and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, maybe never in this particular form. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more structural. The feeling of being in the right place, not the easy place, not the comfortable place, the right one. She'd left Greer County with one bag and no certainty, and the understanding that what she was leaving was worse than whatever she was heading toward. She'd arrived at Cutter's Ford expecting nothing and found something she didn't have a word for yet. She thought about the woman who had stood in that square for 7 hours with her eyes on the ground and her jaw tight and her hands folded, absorbing what the crowd had to offer her and waiting to see if anything better showed up. Something better had shown up. She hadn't recognized it at the time as better. It had looked like a large, scarred, barely speaking mountain man with a broken nose and a shelf of books he'd read 3 times and a life that was going to demand everything she had. It had turned out to be better than she'd known how to imagine. That wasn't the whole story, and she knew it. The year ahead was going to be hard. Hard in the practical sense of cold and work and constant vigilance against a man with money and patience. Hard in the personal sense of 2 people still in the early work of understanding each other, which was a project that didn't have a completion date. There would be more friction, more silences that went the wrong way, more moments of collision between her pace and his, her instinct and his, the different shapes of their stubbornness. But she had the map, and she knew the terrain. The thing that Cutter's Ford had never understood, the thing that Dalton Webb had never understood, that the men who'd laughed in the square hadn't understood, was that what they dismissed as a burden was not a burden at all. The weight Mara Holloway had carried her whole life was not the weight of insufficiency. It was the weight of someone who had been carrying more than her share for so long that she'd built the strength to carry it without anyone noticing. On this mountain someone noticed. That was worth more than being chosen. It was worth more than any of the things that crowd in Cutter's Ford had imagined mattering. She stood up. Her knee, the one she'd hit on the rock in the ravine, registered the cold with a throb she'd come to regard as familiar. She'd been told by enough people in her life that her body was a problem. She'd decided some time ago that it was simply a body and it had gotten her here, and here was good. "Let's go home," she said. Silas stood and they started back along the traverse toward the cabin, moving through the cold and the wind with the sure-footed ease of 2 people who had learned this terrain by walking it together until it was theirs. Below, the eastern approach lay empty. The valley was out there with its settlements and its gossip and its arrangements and its opinions about what a woman was worth and what a man should want. They left it below. The mountain held.